They called her a curse for bearing daughters. Her husband's knuckles did the talking, leaving bruises that painted a story of shame across her skin, all for the crime of not producing a son. For years, a lonely rancher watched from his property line, a silent witness to the cruelty. He saw the 3 little girls hiding from their father's shadow and the fading light in their mother's eyes. Then one dusty evening, something inside him broke. He wasn't a hero, just a man who had seen enough. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. For years, the fence line was a promise Elias Hart made to himself, a silent vow of non-interference. It was a border between his quiet, empty world and the simmering violence of his neighbors. He had learned the rhythms of that violence, the way the dust devils on Silas's property seemed to dance to the tune of his rage. Today, the rhythm was wrong. The air, thick with the late afternoon heat, carried the sharp crack of a hand striking flesh, a sound that was not new but was followed by a different kind of silence, a heavier one, the kind that suffocates hope. It was followed by a choked whimper, quickly swallowed, as if even her pain was an offense. Elias saw Alara stumble out of the house, a red bloom on her cheek, her body a testament to the crime of bearing daughters. He saw her 3 little girls, huddled by a rain barrel like frightened quail, their eyes wide and ancient. And in that moment, the fence posts and rusted wire ceased to be a border and became a cage for his own conscience. It was a cage built from the ghosts of his past, from a feverish night and a small grave he had dug with his own hands. He had failed to protect his own. The wind now whispered that he would not be allowed to fail again. The sun beat down on his neck, a relentless judge, and the accusations in the wind became too loud to ignore. He was a man who spoke more to his cattle than to people, a man who had buried his own heart in this lonely soil long ago. But the sight of those children, the innocence about to be broken, stirred something dormant within him. An old anger, familiar and cold, rose in his chest. His feet moved without permission, crushing the dry grass that separated his land from theirs, each step an undeniable betrayal of the solitude he had cultivated for a decade. The ground felt different under his boots, trespass in every footfall. The world narrowed to the path before him. Silas turned from his wife, his face a mask of smug possession, and saw the encroaching figure. Contempt curdled his features. He was a big man, built on cruelty and entitlement, and he measured the rancher in a single, dismissive glance, a wiry, older man, no match for his own brute strength. But the ghost was walking now. Alara flinched, expecting the confrontation to ignite a new fire upon her. Yet when she looked up, she saw something in the rancher's eyes she hadn't seen in any man's. Not anger, not pity, but a profound and unshakable resolve. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her like a sudden twilight. He didn't look at Silas. His gaze was fixed on Alara, a lifeline thrown across a chasm of despair. The air crackled, a prelude to a storm. Silas opened his mouth, a sneer forming, but Elias spoke first. His voice was low and raspy from disuse, yet it carried an authority that silenced the wind and stopped the sneer on Silas's lips before it could fully form. "You're coming with me." The words were not a question, not an offer, but a statement of fact, as plain and solid as the earth beneath their feet, a single stone tossed into a stagnant pond, its ripples destined to change everything. Silas stood frozen, a statue of pure disbelief, his rage momentarily short-circuited by the sheer audacity of the command. That single moment of hesitation was all the space the world offered, and Elias seized it. He gave Alara one sharp, commanding nod, an entire conversation passing without a word. "Trust me, now. Hurry," and turned his back on the sputtering fuse of his neighbor's fury. The act was a declaration of war, but there was no time for battle, only for retreat. Alara moved as if waking from a long, terrible dream, her hands finding her daughters with a desperate, practiced instinct, pulling them from the shadows of the porch into the dying light. There was no packing, no gathering of memories from a life that held none worth keeping, only the frantic, silent motion of escape, a blur of worn leather shoes and faded calico. The journey began. It was not a walk but a hurried glide over the cracked, thirsty earth, a flight conducted in the language of rustling sagebrush and the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel that sounded like thunder in the immense quiet. Elias led them into the encroaching twilight, his form a dark silhouette against a sky bleeding from orange into a deep, bruised, purple. He never looked back, but his entire being was an ear, straining to hear the footfalls of pursuit over the sound of their own frantic heartbeats. Was this courage, or just a different kind of foolishness? He was a rancher, not a savior, and the weight of these 3 small, stumbling lives on his conscience was a heavier burden than any winter's hardship, an echo of a different child he had failed to protect. Every snapping twig was a gunshot, every gust of wind a pursuing whisper from the life they had just torn open. The youngest girl, no older than 5, began to cry, a thin, exhausted whimper that cut through the tension. Ilara swept her up without breaking stride, the child's small sobs muffled against her shoulder, a sound of pure innocence in a world that had offered none. The landscape itself became an antagonist, a vast and intimidating canvas of looming mesas and skeletal trees that clawed at the last remnants of light, their shadows like pools of ink spilling across the trail. For Ilara, each step away from that house was a step into a terrifying unknown, yet it was also the first true breath of air after a lifetime of drowning, the burning in her lungs a welcome pain. She watched the back of the man ahead of them, a stranger who had offered a lifeline without a smile, without a promise, only the stark reality of his presence. Hope was a fragile, dangerous thing, a flickering candle in the immense darkness of the high desert, and she shielded it with every ounce of her will. The oldest girl, her face a stoic mask mirroring her mother's, stumbled on a loose rock, her small gasp swallowed by the night. Elias stopped for a single, sharp second, his body tensing, his instinct warring between the brutal need for speed and the foreign impulse to help. He did nothing, a small, cruel necessity, and the girl scrambled to her feet, her silence a testament to a childhood spent learning not to be a burden. He pushed onward, the tension stretching with the deepening shadows, a wire pulled taut between the past they fled and the sanctuary they prayed for, a silent, desperate pilgrimage under a cold canopy of indifferent stars. The sanctuary, when they reached it, was little more than a scar on the land, a small, wind-scoured cabin and a barn that leaned with the prevailing wind, all of it a stark reflection of the man who called it home. There were no comforts here, only the brutal honesty of survival etched into the sun-bleached wood. The first days were a lesson in silence, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from fear and awkwardness. Elias was a ghost in his own home, a man so accustomed to solitude that the soft footfalls of children were like thunder in his ears. He would retreat to the barn, the familiar scent of hay and leather a shield against the alien presence in his cabin, while Ilara and her daughters huddled in the single room, their world shrunk to the space between the cold hearth and the door. Haunted by the memory of a heavy hand and a snarling voice, Ilara moved with the caution of a spooked deer, starting at every creak of the floorboards. Yet, within that fear, an old instinct stirred. She began to move, her actions a quiet rebellion against the chaos they had fled. She swept the floor, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a prayer against the silence. She wiped years of dust from the single window, letting in a sliver more light. She organized his few mismatched tins into a neat row, bringing a fragile order to his neglected existence. These were not the actions of a guest, but of a survivor carving out a space to breathe. Elias watched her from the corner of his eye, a silent, conflicted observer. This intrusion was a violation of the quiet emptiness he had mistaken for peace. One afternoon, he found a small, broken doll lying near the woodpile, its cloth arm torn, a casualty of their desperate flight. He picked it up, his calloused fingers clumsy against the delicate, worn fabric. He took it to his workbench in the barn, and for an hour, the only sound was the soft whisper of his knife carving a tiny peg of wood to mend a limb, the careful threading of twine through old seams to fix what was broken. He didn't know why he did it. It was an impulse, a quiet answer to a question no one had asked. He left the mended doll on the porch railing and walked away. Later, through the grimy window, he saw the middle child find it. She didn't shout, but simply held it to her chest, her small shoulders relaxing in a wave of silent relief. She showed her mother, and for the first time, Ilara looked directly at Elias as he stood in the barn doorway. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that shared glance, across the dusty expanse that separated them, the first stone was laid for a bridge, a structure built not of words, but of a mended doll, a swept floor, and the innocent, persistent presence of children in a place that had forgotten the sound of a life being lived. The sun rose on a house that was wrong. The silence that greeted Silas was not the submissive quiet he demanded, but a hollow, defiant emptiness that echoed with insult. It was a void where his property should be. He stood in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the morning light, and the cold realization washed over him not with the heat of panic, but with the icy burn of profound personal theft. This was not the grief of a husband or a father. It was the black, seething fury of a king whose subjects had fled their cage. His mind did not conjure images of their faces, of their well-being or their fear. Instead, he saw the empty chairs at the table, the unmade beds, the missing pair of boots by the door, all offenses against the natural order of his world, a world in which everything and everyone within these walls belonged to him. The rage that built in his chest was a cold, methodical thing, a coiled serpent of wounded pride. Who would dare? The question was a low growl in his soul. His gaze drifted across the yard, past the rain barrel where the girls would huddle, and settled on the faint, almost invisible line that separated his land from his neighbors. Hart. The name was a foul taste in his mouth. The quiet man. The watcher. A man who lived alone, whose own emptiness should have taught him to respect another man's domain. The audacity of it was a physical blow. He walked the perimeter of his house, his movements no longer aimless but imbued with a chilling new purpose. He was not searching. He was hunting. His eyes, accustomed to tracking deer and coyote, scanned the ground, noting the scuffed earth, the unnaturally deep boot prints heading away from the house, and the smaller, frantic tracks that followed. He saw the story of their flight written in the dust, a narrative of betrayal and insubordination. He ran a hand over the gatepost, feeling the splintered wood where it had been swung open with unaccustomed haste. There was no desperation in his search, only a gathering certainty, a terrifying patience. He was a man who understood the hunt, the long, patient pursuit, and the inevitable, brutal end. He knew this land, knew its hiding places, its waterholes, its dead ends. He lifted his gaze and stared at the distant, lonely silhouette of Elias Hart's cabin, a dark speck against the horizon. A slow, cruel smile touched his lips, a chilling expression that held no humor, only the promise of a reckoning. The rage had found its focus, transforming from a blind inferno into a sharp, gleaming point. He would not hurry. He would let the fear settle in, let the false hope take root, because the reclamation of his property would be all the sweeter for it. The harsh edges of their new reality began to soften with the passing of days, smoothed over by the relentless, quiet rhythm of the ranch. Time was marked not by clocks, but by the sun's steady march across the sky, by the morning ritual of fetching water from the cool, deep well and the evening chore of securing the animals against the vast, indifferent night. The oppressive silence of their first few days slowly gave way to a different kind of quiet, one that was not empty, but waiting, filled with the soft scrape of a spoon in a bowl, the whisper of the wind through the eaves, and the rustle of a child's restless sleep. Alara's shoulders, once permanently hunched in anticipation of a blow, began to straighten. Her movements, initially as skittish as a field mouse, became more certain as she claimed a role in this fragile sanctuary. Her hands, once used only to shield her face, became chapped and strong from kneading dough and tending to the small herb garden she'd started near the porch. Each small callus a testament to a resilience that had never been broken, only buried. Elias watched it all from the stoic distance he cultivated like a crop, finding himself an unwilling audience to a life he had forsaken, the simple sight of the girls playing with stones in the dust, stirring painful, ghostly echoes of a past he kept locked away. He was caught in the gravitational pull of their healing. Then, one afternoon, the sound shattered his solitude. It was a laugh, a bright, sudden, and utterly foreign noise that the dry air seemed unequipped to carry. The youngest girl, chasing a grasshopper, had tumbled harmlessly into the soft dust, and the surprise of it had burst from her not as a cry, but as a peal of pure, untainted joy. It was a sound Elias hadn't heard in a decade, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow, cracking the frozen surface of his grief. The sound was infectious, sparking a chain of smaller giggles from her sisters and, finally, drawing a tired, genuine smile from Alara. In that moment, watching them from the shade of the barn, Elias felt the true weight of his decision. He had brought them here to save them from a tangible danger, but their very presence, their slow blooming in the safety he provided, had become a different kind of threat. His solitude had been a fortress, a barren but impenetrable defense against memory. Now, the laughter of these children was dismantling it stone by stone. His growing feelings of protectiveness were a double-edged sword. They gave him a purpose he hadn't realized he'd lost, but they also put his own carefully constructed peace at immense risk. Every small sign of their trust, a daughter asking him a shy question about a horse, Alara leaving a plate of food for him on the porch, was both a balm and a wound. The balm soothed the ache of loneliness. The wound was the terrifying prospect of having something precious to lose all over again. He was becoming their shield, but in doing so, he was lowering his own. It was in the quiet war against the cabin's accumulated dust and neglect that she found it. Tucked away on the highest shelf, wrapped in a faded piece of oilcloth, lay a secret he had forgotten he was keeping. Alara's hands, now accustomed to the rhythms of this house, carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside rested a small, handcrafted wooden horse, its form so worn and smooth that the grain of the wood felt like polished stone. It was a simple thing, yet the gentle curve of its back and the patient detail of its carved mane spoke of a love that was anything but. She knew, with an instinct born of her own motherhood, that this was not a toy, but a relic, the ghost of a small hand that had held it, a sacred object from a life that existed before the silence. She was holding it when Elias returned from the corral, the setting sun casting a long, weary shadow behind him. She didn't speak, didn't need to. She simply stood in the middle of the room and held it out to him, her eyes not accusatory, but filled with a deep, sorrowful question. The sight of the horse in her hands did what Silas's threats and the girl's tears could not. It broke him. His stoic mask, the carefully constructed wall of indifference, crumbled into dust. The air left his lungs in a ragged gasp, and for a moment, the cabin was not a cabin, but a tomb filled with the ghosts of a different life. The memory, long buried, rushed back with the force of a flash flood, the crisp scent of pine shavings as he carved the toy by firelight, the sound of his son's laughter, a bright, beautiful noise that had once filled these silent walls. Thomas. His name was a wound that had never closed. He remembered the warmth of his wife, Anna, her hand on his back as she watched him work, her smile the true hearth of their home. Then came the fever, a merciless thief in the night, the cloying smell of sickness, the useless poultices, the endless, helpless nights. He remembered the silence that came after, a silence so profound and absolute that it had become the foundation of his world. It was all there, in the sudden, raw grief that hollowed out his eyes. He didn't tell Alara the whole story, not in words. He couldn't. But as he reached out and his trembling fingers brushed against the smooth wood, she saw it all. She saw the husband and the father beneath the grim, silent rancher. And in that shared, heartbreaking moment of understanding, his actions were reframed. He hadn't saved her and her daughters out of simple charity or moral duty. He was a haunted man, desperately trying to stand guard over the ghosts of his past by protecting the living. A man trying to heal his own scarred history by giving this new, fragile family the sanctuary he had failed to give his own. The fragile peace on the ranch had begun to feel real, its roots taking hold in the soil of shared routine and unspoken understanding. The days bled into a gentle rhythm. Alara taught her eldest daughter, Sarah, how to knead dough, her hands moving with a long-forgotten confidence. The scent of baking bread a testament to their newfound domesticity. The sound of the children's play was no longer a startling intrusion but a part of the landscape's music, a counterpoint to the lowing of cattle and the whisper of the wind. But miles away, a different rhythm was beating, a violent, determined drumbeat of hoofs on hard-packed earth. Silas rode into the dusty outpost of Harmony Creek not as a man searching for his family, but as a storm seeking a place to break. His questions were not pleas but accusations, his eyes sweeping over the faces of wary townsfolk, searching for the flicker of fear that would betray a secret. He cornered a young blacksmith, his shadow swallowing the boy in the firelight of the forge, his voice a low growl as he described a quiet man, a woman, 3 daughters. His grip on the boy's shoulder a silent promise of pain until a stammered admission emerged. Yes, a man fitting that description had bought supplies weeks ago, more than a man alone would need. Back at the ranch, Elias was showing the middle daughter, Clara, how to brush down his mare, his large, rough hands guiding her small ones, an act of such gentle trust that it sent a pang through his chest, a feeling so potent it almost felt like hope. He was beginning to forget what true silence felt like. The memory was shattered by a sudden cut to Silas, his horse kicking up dust as he left the blacksmith's. His mind a cold ledger of facts, one more piece of the puzzle clicking into place. He rode to the general store, his presence curdling the air, his questions now more specific, more pointed. He intimidated the store owner with a look, a quiet threat that hinted at a rage that could level the whole shoddy establishment, and learned of the purchase of 3 small dresses, a detail so intimate and infuriating it stoked the fires of his possessive fury. The chase was no longer a matter of instinct, but of certainty. As Ilara watched her youngest daughter sleep in the late afternoon sun, a deep, bone-weary sense of safety settling over her for the first time in her life, Silas was leaning over a frightened homesteader miles away, a man who had seen Elias's wagon turn onto the old, forgotten northern trail. The final piece was his. As the sun began to set on the ranch, casting long, peaceful shadows, Silas turned his horse northward, the fading light glinting in his eyes not with warmth, but with the cold, predatory gleam of a wolf that has finally caught the scent of its quarry on the wind and knows the hunt is almost over. He appeared as if summoned from the earth itself, a dark, unmoving figure standing at the distant fence line where the property began. The children's laughter died first, a sudden, sharp silence that was more alarming than any scream. Ilara's heart seized in her chest, the fragile piece of the past weeks shattering into 1,000 pieces of ice. Elias saw him too, and without a word, he moved. He didn't run, didn't draw a weapon, but simply walked to the center of the yard and planted his feet, his body becoming a silent, unbreachable wall between the cabin and the approaching threat. The world seemed to hold its breath. Silas did not advance with rage, but with a slow, deliberate confidence, his hands held open in a gesture of false peace. He stopped just short of the true property line, keeping a calculated distance. The confrontation was not to be one of fists, but of words laced with poison. "Ilara," he called out, his voice a horrifying parody of warmth, a sound designed to crawl under her skin and awaken old fears. "Ilara, honey, it's time to come home now. This foolishness has gone on long enough." Elias remained silent, a granite statue of refusal. Silas ignored him, his eyes fixed on the cabin doorway where he knew she was watching, his words a direct assault on the foundations of her new life. "He can't give you anything, you know. Look at this place. A shell. You have a home. The girls have a father." He took a step closer, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate, more menacing. "I've been patient. I've been understanding. But my patience is at an end. You have a place. You have duties. Don't make me remind you what happens when you forget them." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to reawaken the woman who flinched, who submitted, who knew her place was in the shadow of his rage. From the doorway, Ilara felt the old terror coiling in her stomach, the instinct to obey, to make the anger stop screaming at her. This was the central moral conflict of her life, reaching its terrible boiling point. She could retreat back into the familiar prison, or she could stand on the scorched earth of this new freedom. Silas saw her hesitation, his lips curling into a triumphant sneer as he delivered what he believed would be the final blow. "Think of the girls. Ilara, what kind of life is this for them, hiding behind a broken-down old man? They belong with me." But the mention of her daughters did not break her. It forged her. The fear in her eyes was burned away by a fire he had never seen before. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped out of the shadows of the doorway and walked to stand a few feet behind Elias, her presence a silent, irrefutable answer. The psychological war was over. And in Silas's eyes, the mask of manipulation dissolved, replaced by the pure, unfiltered promise of violence to come. Ilara's silent defiance was the spark that ignited the inferno. The last vestiges of Silas's manipulative charm vanished, burned away by a pure, homicidal rage as he finally crossed the invisible line of the property, his world shrinking to a single, violent objective. He lunged, not at Elias, but past him, a predatory feint toward the cabin, and in that instant the war of words erupted into a brutal, physical clash. Elias intercepted him, his body a solid, unyielding obstacle, and the two men crashed together with the sound of splintering wood and grunts of raw effort that were torn from their lungs. There was no flair or artistry in Elias's movements. This was not a duel of honor, but a grim, desperate struggle for survival against a man possessed. He revealed a quiet, hardened strength born not of brawling, but of a lifetime spent wrestling with stubborn livestock and unforgiving land. A strength rooted in endurance, not aggression. He absorbed Silas's wild, powerful blows, the taste of blood and dust filling his mouth, his face a mask of pained determination as he fought with the grim necessity of a man who had more to lose than just his own life. The yard became a maelstrom of dust and violence, a stark, brutal ballet set against the backdrop of the three small, terrified figures huddled behind their mother, their wide, innocent eyes, a silent testament to the stakes. To them, it was a horrifying blur of thrashing limbs, the sounds of their father's rage, a familiar terror made new and strange as it crashed against the quiet protector who now bled for them. Silas, younger and fueled by a limitless well of fury, began to gain the upper hand, his fists finding their mark with sickening repetition, driving Elias back step by agonizing step. He forced Elias to the ground, his hands closing around the older man's throat, a triumphant, hateful sneer on his face. He was reclaiming what was his, erasing the man who had dared to stand in his way. But in that moment, watching the life being squeezed from the only man who had ever shown her kindness, Elara made her final choice. For a split second, the old fear screamed at her to run, to hide, to submit as she had always done. But another voice, fierce and primal, rose to shout it down. The old bonds of fear, the chains of a decade of submission, did not just break. They vaporized in a flash of pure, protective fire. With a cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul, she moved. Her hands found a heavy log from the woodpile, its weight familiar and solid, an extension of the hearth she now commanded. She lifted it, the world narrowing to a single point of impact, and brought it down with all her strength against the side of Silas's head. The impact was a sickening, final crack that echoed in the sudden, deafening silence. Silas crumpled, his grip loosening, his body falling limp beside the man he was about to kill. The violence was over as quickly as it had begun. Elara stood over them, the piece of firewood still held tight in her hands, its splinters digging into her palms, her chest heaving not with fear, but with the fierce, ragged breath of a woman who had just saved her family and, in doing so, had finally saved herself. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than any sound, a thick, ringing void where the map of their future was being redrawn in the dust. They did not celebrate. They did not speak. In the deepening twilight, with the metallic scent of blood and sweat sharp in the cooling air, Elara's first instinct was not of relief, but of absolute protection. She gathered her daughters into an unbreakable circle, her arms a shield, her voice a low, steady murmur, promising a safety she had only just now secured for them. Only when their trembling had subsided did she turn back to the wreckage in the yard. Elias, with grim, aching movements that spoke of bruised ribs and a soul-deep weariness, bound the unconscious form of Silas, and with Elara's silent help, loaded him onto his own horse like a sack of grain. The long journey to town to deliver the man to the law was a somber, necessary pilgrimage made under the cold witness of the stars, a final act of closing a door on a lifetime of terror. The night that followed was a crucible, a long, sleepless vigil, where the sharp adrenaline of survival gave way to the deep, shuddering exhaustion of trauma. When Elias returned, a ghost in the pre-dawn gloom, Elara tended to his wounds by the flickering firelight without a word, cleaning a cut on his cheek with a gentle but sure touch, a quiet acknowledgement of the debt that could never be repaid. He accepted her care with a stoic nod, a new, profound understanding passing between them in the lamplight, a bond forged not of affection, but of shared violence and mutual salvation. Later, he sat on the porch, a rifle resting across his lap, his vigil not for any returning threat, but for the new, fragile life that now slept within his walls. The quiet solitude he had once cherished, now a ghost of a forgotten past. When the first pale gray light of dawn began to erase the stars, they found themselves drawn outside, one by one, into the cool, clean air of the new day. The children emerged first, their faces scrubbed clean of tears, but their eyes holding a new, solemn wisdom that no child should possess. Then came Elara, her posture straight, her gaze clear and unafraid. Finally, Elias, his body aching, his face a roadmap of the previous day's brutality, joined them. They stood together, not as a family in a portrait, not huddled close for warmth, but as four separate, scarred survivors, a loose constellation looking toward the horizon. The rising sun was a fire on the edge of the world, a cinematic visual metaphor for a hope they had not dared to wish for, its light painting the harsh landscape in shades of soft, forgiving gold. They were not whole. They were four broken people, bound by the terrible memory of what had passed, and the unspoken promise of what might now be possible. This was not an ending, but a beginning, paid for in blood and fear. And as they watched the new day wash over the land that was now their sanctuary, a question hangs in the air, a question for all who have borne witness to their struggle. How much land must a man own before he owns a conscience too?